Well, let's start our first in a series of weekly videos that will apply what we learn at all three levels of CFA. And even if you're just a level 1 candidate, don't feel too intimidated by any new content that I would introduce from level 2 and 3 about what we're doing. It's, I think, helpful to see it applied now and become familiar with it. So this is how it's going to work. Is each week I'm going to put up a video about either something happening in the world in terms of the economy or finance, and we're going to look at it from two different perspectives because that's what the content allows us to do. There is no one single way to interpret everything. So we're going to look at this from two different perspectives, and you will decide what you feel is the appropriate way to look at it, because as an analyst later on you're going to have to face that challenge where the data could be saying this, or the data could be saying that, or the theory could be pointing in this direction, or this theory could be pointing in another direction, and you have to pick a path to follow of what you believe is the more correct path to follow. Now, while I'm introducing the arguments, I'm going to introduce them at a very high level. I'm not going to dive into all of the small detail that may sway an argument one way or another. That's for you to do. I'm going to give you the framework to think about this. I'm going to give you the big economic arguments on both sides to think about this. And then in the comment box below, you will then pick a side. And how it works is like this. You have to learn how to argue. So saying something like, oh, I think we should do this because we need to save the environment. That's not an argument, that's a premise. Is you're arguing for a course of action because of some outcome, and you need arguments to support that. So no premises, only arguments. So let's begin. This has happened in the last, I think, week or two. Trump administration to freeze fuel efficiency standards and fight states who want to oppose that and say, no, we have to continue to raise our fuel standards. I think it was in 2011, 2012, the Obama administration set some fuel standards. As part of the bailout package for the Detroit 3, they said, look, you got to start making cars that Americans want. You got to start increasing your fuel efficiency standards. We gave you a bailout, now you got to do this. And it is part of lowering emissions and moving towards a lower carbon output environment, or at least trying to get back to standards or emissions set in 1990, etc. And there's controversy whether or not that's going to work, and we'll look at it. But not doing something wasn't politically appropriate at the time. The administration had to be seen to be making a move towards some kind of a higher level of fuel efficiency on this, to care about the environment, etc. So we'll see whether or not it makes any sense. We'll lay out that argument. We'll lay out the Obama argument first of why this makes sense, why it should be done, and the effect it's supposed to have. The goal isn't necessarily to raise fuel standards. The goal is to accelerate the shift to electric, and we'll see how that's done using just level 1 microeconomics. And then we'll ask ourselves, does that make sense? We'll look at some potential problems with that, and then we'll introduce, I don't want to say it's Trump's idea, because I believe that Trump is doing this just to get rid of Obama's standard. I don't think he understands the impact of it. He just says, Obama did that? Well, it's got to go. It's got to go without any consideration. However, the expression, even a blind nut finds a squirrel every now and then. Well, even somebody who doesn't understand what they're doing can get something right every now and then. And we'll look at his approach. And his approach falls into something called the Austrian School of Economics. And we'll see what that implication is. So let's begin. All right, here's the content, the ideas from the content that we're going to be using. Level 1 economics, level 2 economics, and we're going to apply this. Level 1 economics, we're going to look at substitutes and complements. So you'll remember the formulas for quantity demanded of a particular product, X. So we have QX. Intercept minus some coefficient on the price minus some coefficient on the price of a complement. So this would be, let's say, gasoline, because it's a complement product. You buy the two together, right? So the higher the price, what this is saying, the higher the price of a vehicle, we can see a negative sign in front of it. The lower the quantity demanded will be. The higher the price of gasoline, the lower the quantity demanded will be. And PX is the price of internal combustion engines. For substitutes, we have PY. PY is an electric vehicle. And notice we have a plus sign in front of the beta 2 here, which means that as the price of electric vehicles increase, it increases the quantity demanded for internal combustion because we have a plus sign there, right? A negative sign in front of another price means we have a complement. A plus sign means we have a substitute. We've learned that in level 1 microeconomics. Now we're going to apply it and we're going to see how these regulations affected either the price of the complement or the price of the substitute, and what that means for the quantity demanded of internal combustion engines. From level 2, we're going to talk about the economics of regulation, because we had a regulation introduced and now we're having a regulation taken away. We're going to look at it in terms of externalities, and the externalities are CO2 emissions and the role that regulation plays in something like an externality. We'll look at the idea of public goods. And sometimes you need regulation to step in when public goods are involved, because no one individual is going to spend money to protect public goods. So public goods here, we're talking about the environment, the atmosphere, and we're going to look at tools of regulation, primarily the price mechanism. We're going to look at subsidies and taxes. And then we're going to introduce something called interdependence of regulation, but we'll get to that when we look at some of the problems. So this is what we're going to apply. Number 1, we're going to look at Obama's pathway. And Obama's pathway really dealt with our second formula here, the substitute. So the regulation was set up such that it affected this equation here. Once we remove the Obama era regulations and look at what the Trump administration is doing, it works on this equation. However, I don't think they intended that. It's just by removing the regulation, you end up working on this equation here. And I'm going to argue that this equation is the better equation to work on because it has less unintended consequences. So let's introduce ourselves to the Obama era regulation. Okay, so we're going to deal with substitutes, or at least the equation for substitutes. So I've rewritten the equation here, and we're going to see how we're going to affect the price of internal combustion and how we'll affect the price of electric. Here are the fuel standards that were introduced. Vehicles or car companies had to produce these average mile or average fuel standards by 2020, and by 2025, 35 miles per gallon, 50 miles per gallon. These are what are called CAFE standards, C-A-F-E, and I think that means a corporate average fuel economy standards. This is fleet-wide. So this is saying fleet-wide by 2020, the automakers have to be producing a fleet that gets 35 miles per gallon. That doesn't mean every vehicle does. What it's saying is that if you want to make those big, heavy SUVs that get very few mileage, you got to make a lot of smaller cars that do get that mileage. But your fleet overall must reach those standards, and 50 miles per gallon by 2025. Look at that short time span. You got 5 years to get it up almost 50%. That's huge. The economic rationale for regulation for doing this is market solutions will not be adequate. And here we're talking about the externalities. Externalities are not in the price of the vehicle. So the thinking is, well, we can bring externalities into the price of the vehicle by saying, well, let's make a vehicle that has no externalities, or that has very little externalities. Well, that's going to drive up the cost of the vehicle. So let's look at our equation here. PY is the price of electric cars. PX is the price of internal combustion. So what they do is they apply two tools. One, regulation will drive up the price. I have the arrow up. Will drive up the price of the internal combustion engine because you've got to invest money into some engineering on that engine to get those fuel standards higher. Subsidies provided to electric vehicles, and people who bought electric vehicles will lower the price of electric vehicles. So if you lower the price of electric vehicles, since this has a plus sign, it will lower the quantity demanded for internal combustion. If you raise the price of internal combustion engines, since this has a negative sign, it lowers the quantity demanded. So what they were trying to do was work on the demand for internal combustion engines and say, well, here's what we're going to do. We're either going to lower demand, we're going to try to get the price of internal combustion up and the price of electric down with subsidies so that suddenly switching is not that difficult. Most people will switch to electric when given the choice if it's the same price. So at least that's the thinking. Let's do that. And if they don't switch, well, guess what we're doing with the vehicle? We're making it far more fuel efficient, so it'll have lower emissions. Overall, for every kilometer driven, it will use less gasoline, so it'll produce less emissions. So their thinking is, well, we win either way. People don't like the price of vehicles, internal combustion. Well, they can always switch to electric. If they do buy an internal combustion engine, well, guess what? Their operating costs will be lower because they will go further on every gallon of gas. What's not to like about that? Higher prices for internal combustion, lower prices for electric, leads to lower quantity demanded of internal combustion engines. What we can do is we can take our particular formula here that we had for the quantity demanded of internal combustion engines and look at the quantity demanded for electric cars. And it prices out this way. Notice that we simply change the location of where our variables are. So if we look at it this way, what we're going to get is lower prices for electric, which is what we set up here, and higher prices for internal combustion, which is what we set up here, higher quantity demanded of electric. So take the two. You'll get lower quantity demanded for internal combustion, higher quantity demanded for electric. You'll have fewer internal combustion engines on the road, more electric vehicles on the road. That's the goal, is to accelerate that change to electric. And by doing that, we end up saving the environment. And for those who do not switch, well, at least they're operating a more fuel efficient vehicle. And over time, as soon as electric hits some tipping point, then it'll really start to take off, because now they'll be made in volume. What we need to do is help the car companies achieve that level of volume faster. It sounds like a good argument. So when you look at this, you say, well, that makes a lot of sense. There's a role for government to play here. Clearly, we have to do something about emissions. Clearly, this addresses emissions by getting the fuel standards up. The subsidies to lower the price of electric vehicles, the extra cost of innovation to raise the price of internal combustion will accelerate the shift to electric. What's not to like? Where's the downside? Why would an administration come in and say, nope, let's get rid of these fuel standards? This is off the table, by the way, in the removal of the standards. That's off the table. Now, they're not repealing the standards. They're not saying let's roll them back. They're freezing them. They're frozen. That's it. So as far as the car companies are concerned, they don't have to spend the money to get here, which means this is probably not going to increase at the rate that we want. And these are gone, by the way, so that's not going to decrease at the rate that they want. And this is not just limited to the U.S. In Ontario, in Canada, a province in Canada, for those who aren't familiar with Canada, we have a new premier who is from the Conservative Party. We just threw out the Liberals, and boy did we throw out the Liberals. Oh, they're not even an official party anymore. They lost so badly. They're not even an official party anymore. So that's something to smile about. But we got a kind of a jackass as a premier, so, good and bad together, right? Anyways, he got rid of the subsidies on electric vehicles. They're gone. Which Tesla is now suing the province because of that, by the way. So it's not just limited to the Trump administration. But anyway, these are frozen. These are gone. So we sort of look at this and we say, well, that kind of ruins everything. I thought we really wanted to make that move over to electric. This ruins everything. How can this possibly be better? Well, we're going to look at that in a second. But before we get there, let's look at the problems of all of this. And it causes quite a few problems. So at level 2, there's a reading called, in the economics section, called The Economics of Regulation. And there's a section that talks about unintended consequences of regulation, that whenever you put a regulation in, you have some intended outcomes that you want. However, companies are strategic, people are strategic, and if they know where the goalposts are, they can maneuver around the goalposts. So let's look at some of these unintended consequences. There was some nearsightedness in the regulation in thinking that, well, if we raise the price of internal combustion engines and lower the price of electric, we'll accelerate the shift over to electric. And they identified the electric car as the substitute. But what most strategists get wrong, and most analysts get wrong, is a substitute for anything you're thinking of is to do nothing. Is the consumer can simply do nothing, and that is a viable substitute. As the price of internal combustion engines increase, older cars stay on the road longer. So you end up saying, well, listen, at least the fleet will be more fuel efficient. No, it won't. If the price goes up and people don't want electric, they're just going to stay in 8 or 9-year-old cars that have very bad fuel standards and higher emissions because they're older vehicles. Older cars stay on the road longer. They are less fuel efficient. Number 2, consumer behavior. You have to think about, how do consumers buy big ticket items? Typically, they don't look at the sticker price, they look at their monthly payment. Consumers manage monthly payment, not the sticker price. So even if the price of the vehicle they want is going up, they will manage the monthly price. So there's financial innovation. You now have 7-year loans, 7-year vehicle loans. That's ridiculous, by the way, but there it is. 7-year vehicle loans are now on the market because of that. Well, I shouldn't say because of that, but because of the price creep on vehicles, partly driven by this drive to get higher fuel standards. You now have 7-year loans. So you're not really doing anything to convince people to leave. If they say, look, I can afford $500 a month, I've always paid $500 a month. Well, we can put you in this SUV for $500 a month on a 7-year loan. What do you think? And the consumer, most of the time, looks at the $500 and says, yeah, that's what I can afford. I'll take it. So we missed number one, the do nothing from the consumer as a substitute. Number 2 is the consumer behavior on how they buy big ticket items. Number 3, better fuel efficiency, consumer moral license. What does that mean? Well, we have lower operating costs, so consumers can drive more. It's called a rebound effect. And if you combine 1, 2, and 3 together, you have lower demand growth for gasoline. Notice we don't say lower demand for gasoline, it's lower demand growth for gasoline. You'll slow down the growth in demand as the population increases, as more cars hit the road. Growth will just slow down. So you don't end up actually reducing the macro amount of emissions. You may introduce it at a micro level. Per car, the emissions are lower, but overall, they're going to continue to climb. You will get a slower burn for longer. Because the growth is slower, you'll just burn gasoline for a longer period of time. So you're not really going to accelerate very much on that case. By the way, when we look at number 3 here, better fuel efficiency, gives consumers moral license. That is a well-proven effect, the rebound effect. Where you see it most prevalently, and probably the worst thing that could have been done to the health of most North Americans, is the introduction of fat-free food and the label fat-free. Because when consumers buy potato chips that are fat-free, they think, they're fat-free. They eat more of them, without considering the fact that, hang on, fat-free potato chips have just as many calories as fat potato chips. The calories just come from different sources. Or there's slightly fewer calories, but not much more. So they end up eating more calories because they think it's fat-free. It gives them moral license to say, I don't have to control how much I eat. So if you have better fuel efficiency, and you were spending $100 a week in gasoline to commute, and now it's only $50 a week, before you might not have gone to the mall for one thing. Now you say, well, let's go to the mall, let's go here, let's go there. You'll use your vehicle more because, well, it's cheap to operate, so it gives you moral license. So it's not really going to do anything. What you have to do, look at number 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3 point to one common variable. Stay in your old car, not buy a new one. That's consumer behavior. Manage your monthly payment, consumer behavior. Moral license, consumer behavior. You have not changed consumer behavior. You've changed prices, but you haven't changed consumer behavior. So that's a big drawback here. You haven't hit that yet. Number 4, and this is the obvious argument made, and it's a good argument, I think. To meet rising fuel efficiency standards, you simply just make lighter vehicles. Lighter vehicles are less safe because when they get hit, well, they're lighter. They don't hold their ground. They move more, and they move more with humans in them. To go from 35 miles per gallon to 50 miles per gallon in 5 years, you can get there with some engine innovation, but not without a major leap in change in the engine. You can make it the rest of the way by just making the vehicle lighter, taking things out, changing from steel to aluminum, etc., but you make lighter vehicles. Number 5, tragedy of the commons. The atmosphere, the environment is a public good. It's a global public good, not a national public good. It's not like a national park. It's a global public good. Unless all countries do it, you end up with a free rider problem. One country may say, yeah, you guys all go ahead and do that. We're not. We're just going to stay the way we are right now, and you guys pay for everything. So unless everybody gets involved, well, it doesn't work. And that was what the Paris Accord was really meant to do, was to get everybody on board. But the U.S. pulled out of that, right? And finally, let's look at regulatory interdependence. And this is saying that a regulation in one place can sometimes be offset by a regulation in another place. What good is all this when you still continue to give subsidies to oil companies? When you give subsidies to oil companies, you lower their break-even per barrel. If you really wanted to do this right, you would say, well, okay, if we got regulation that's affecting the internal combustion engine and forcing a shift away from that to electric, let's do away with this. We're helping both sides, and which means you're sort of negating the two together, right? So there we go. When you add this all up, you would say, well, you know, yeah, there are these problems, but it does work, and I'll agree with that. Yeah, at the margin, it is doing something. It is having an effect. So what's the big deal? Why cancel something that, okay, it's not perfect, but it's having some effect. It's doing something. We're doing something at least. Why get rid of it all? Well, I'm going to make the argument that getting rid of it all actually will accelerate what we want done. We'll actually do it faster. May not be pretty, but it's going to be faster. So let's have a look at that. All right, now we're going to work on complements, not substitutes. Substitutes are gone. We're going to focus on complements. The biggest pushback against critics of the Trump administration for freezing the standards is that it's going to do nothing more but raise the price of gasoline and make it unaffordable for consumers to drive. And that's their biggest pushback on this. My answer to that is, yeah, that's exactly what it's going to do, and that's exactly what we want it to do. We don't want to affect the price of the substitute. We want to affect the price of the complement. That's a faster route to get to where we want to go. Fuel standards, none. Get rid of them all. Don't just freeze them at 35 miles per gallon. I say get rid of them all. Have no fuel standards whatsoever. If a car company wants to put out a vehicle that gets 1 mile per gallon and there's demand for it, I say sell it. I say let them do it. That's exactly what you want them to do, is to run into the fire that way. Carbon taxes, none. Don't tax it. Don't tax any of it at all. Let people and companies do whatever they want. Let them go at this point. Subsidies, oil companies, electric cars, none. Yeah, you got to get rid of these subsidies to the oil companies. But electric cars, none. I say nothing. Look at this. No fuel standards, no carbon taxes, no subsidies. This is consistent with Austrian economics, which is minimal government. If you want a more effective price system, what you want to do is you want to get the government out of the economy altogether. And Austrian economics argues that if you let the price system work, if you get out of the way and let the price system work, it will come up with the best outcome all the time. Minimal government, let the free market work. Well, let's see how this is going to work. Here's our formula again, quantity demanded of internal combustion engines. Notice we have our negative coefficient in front of the price of internal combustion engines, and we have a plus sign in front of the coefficient for the complement, which is gasoline in this case. PZ is the price of gasoline. So all of this will actually lead to less higher prices for vehicles. I'm not going to say lower prices, because the price of vehicles have never actually gone down like they do with computers and televisions. They always go up. But it'll be less higher prices. In other words, the growth in the price, the inflation in the price of vehicles is not going to have that huge cost of innovation built into it. Hey, look, we can go back to technology we already have, right? So you'll have less higher prices. And remember, consumers manage their monthly payment. So if they manage their monthly payment and you have less higher prices, this is what's going to happen. They will buy more vehicle for their dollar. In other words, instead of taking the mid-sized vehicle because prices are increasing and they want to manage their monthly payment, they'll take larger sized vehicles because they can manage their monthly payment. So they'll buy more vehicle than they can. Again, when we look at consumer behavior buying durable goods, big ticket items, this is how it's done. A couple will go to a bank and say, how much house can I afford? They won't say, here's the house that I want. How much house can I afford? Here's the monthly payment that I can make. And they're given a number, and they will go buy as much house as they can. Well, if you do the same thing with cars, well, how much monthly payment can I afford for a vehicle? I can afford $500. How much vehicle can I get for $500? They won't take something for $400 or $350. They want $500 a month. They'll buy as much vehicle for $500. So they'll buy more vehicle for it. A V8 instead of a V6 or an inline 6. I don't know if they make inline 6 anymore, but anyways, you get what I'm saying. They'll go for the 8-cylinder instead of the 6-cylinder. Lower fuel efficiency. They will get vehicles with lower fuel efficiency. You may think, well, consumers don't want that. This is what consumers want, at least Western consumers. Western consumers don't want small cars. They want big cars. They just want small gas bills. If you can give them a really big car with a small gas bill, they'll take it. But they don't want small cars. They want small gas bills, and that's what they'll manage. If we slow down the rate at which consumers demand gasoline, it keeps prices low. And when you have low prices, consumers will reach for the biggest vehicle they can. You want them into smaller vehicles. You want them into electric vehicles. You have to raise the operating cost of that vehicle. Not raise the price of the vehicle, raise the operating cost of the vehicle. Well, that's what you get here. Gasoline, you'll have higher prices. You'll have higher operating costs. Remember now, higher car prices, you'll get financial innovation. But higher gas prices, that's where you start to get changing behavior. Suddenly, gas is expensive. Your daughter asks you for a ride to the mall, take a bus. I'm not driving. Are you kidding? Have you seen the price of gas? You're not going to drive to the store just to get one item. You're going to wait. You're going to change your behavior. You're going to start to think about carpooling because suddenly it's $150 to fill your tank for a week, not $100. You got to think about that. You'll start to change your behavior. Well, if you raise the operating costs of the vehicle, guess what you're doing for total cost of ownership? Total cost of ownership is approaching that of electric, and at higher gas prices, total cost of ownership will exceed the price of electric. Suddenly, the electric vehicle is more expensive up front, but you have those lower operating costs. Think about it this way. For anyone who's ever gone to buy a printer, you can get the $50 printer, but then go buy ink. Ink cartridges are $80 each. It's cheaper just to buy another printer. Or you can get the $500 printer, and when you buy your toner cartridges or your ink cartridges, you find out they're super, super cheap in terms of what it costs to print per page. Doesn't take long before you say, you know what, those $50 printers, that's just garbage. They cost so much to print. You never want to print anything. You buy new cartridges, you put your printer up, you go, I'm not printing anything. That ink was expensive. Well, how dumb is that, right? You fill your car with gasoline, you say, I'm not driving it. Gas is too expensive. Well, there you go. That's what you want. You want to change that behavior. So we get changing behavior. So combine the two things together. Lower fuel efficiency on this side, higher operating costs on this side. You'll get fewer miles or kilometers driven, a faster shift to electric. You'll get there faster. It'll be ugly because emissions will spike for a very short period of time. Remember, under the Obama plan, we had a slower burn for longer. Here you'll get a higher burn for shorter. But then you get to the other side where electric has scale, and that's your choice. That's it. Internal combustion will disappear much like VHS has disappeared. It will simply disappear. But you need it to disappear by making electric the dominant one, and to do that, you don't run away from the fire, you have to run into the fire. It's the quickest way to the other side, and on the other side, guess what? There's no fire because everything's burnt. Maybe that was a bad analogy to use there. But taking this route, my argument is that taking this route is faster. It's painful for the consumer. You have less government intervention, though, less taxes that have to be used to enforce all of this stuff, less strain on the car makers. And you have not just a gradual transition, but you'll have a rapid transition to electric, because once gas starts hitting $5 a gallon, $6 a gallon, behavior is going to change. Back in, just before the financial crisis, back in 2008, when I was in the U.S., gas was $4.20 a gallon. At least in Cleveland, where I was, it was $4.20 a gallon. That's all everybody talked about. That's all they talked about. It dominated everything. You couldn't believe the price. People were going and getting a quarter tank or a half tank at a time because they just couldn't afford to fill up their whole tank. They were changing their behavior. And had that stayed, had we been able to stay with that trend, we would be much further along the electric car route now than we have by following the idea of let's try to save the internal combustion engine by just making it a cleaner engine, a better engine. Well, there it is. There's the argument laid out. There are two sides of the argument. I haven't brought in all of the small details that, oh, but you didn't mention this and you didn't mention that. No, these are the big outlines of each one, the big framework of each one. What do you think? Which side are you on? Now, again, you can't just list a premise. Oh, I think we should go with number one because we have to save the environment. Well, or number two because we have to save the environment. Again, that's a premise. An argument, a cogent argument that brings in a fact or some data that supports one or another. And that's it. I'll have another one up next week.